On today's episode, we continue our study of understanding Revelation by digging into Revelation chapter 12. Next, on Thinking Aloud. Welcome to Thinking Aloud. I'm your host, Michael Wilson, and I just want to say thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to tune in, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening to this on another podcast stream. I appreciate your time, your energy. I appreciate all of you that have subscribed, those of you that have liked these episodes. That really helps us get out in front of more people. And I really do appreciate it. We're going to jump right into our study of understanding Revelation as we demystify this mystical book. And we've been on this series for quite some time now. And in this episode, we're going to see a major shift as we jump into Revelation chapter 12, because God is finished dealing with the judgments on Israel, but now he turns his gaze upon Rome, or empire in general. So we're going to see a major shift in what John has seen. We're going to be introduced to the dragon. And if you are coming from a dispensational futuristic view, which is what I grew up with, then you're still looking for all of that to happen in the future. But if you look at it from the angle of which I'm presenting it, which is called a partial preterist viewpoint, you will see that all of this happened in the first century, specifically between the years of 30 AD and 70 AD, as Jesus died on the cross, was resurrected, ascended into heaven, and that began a 40-year transition period from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. And we've seen all that, and we've overlaid chapters 6 through 11 back onto Matthew 24 in previous episodes. And in the first couple of episodes, we laid a lot of introductory groundwork. But now this scene is shifting. John is seeing a dragon, and we're going to be talking about the dragon and the beast and the mark of the beast as we go along in the next couple of episodes. But the one thing that I want to just throw out there right off the bat is that if you believe in a futuristic time, that this is all going to happen in the future, then you're waiting for the Antichrist to appear. However, Revelation does not mention the word Antichrist whatsoever. The word is not in Revelation at all. The word Antichrist is in 1 John and 2 John, and John gives a very specific definition of what the Antichrist is. The Antichrist is a spirit or a way of thinking. It is denying that Jesus has come in the flesh. And you can read that in 1 John. In the book of 1 John, John was battling Gnosticism, and I believe that that is where the spirit of Antichrist resides, in the teaching of Gnosticism. But in Revelation, specifically chapter 12 and onward, we do read about a dragon, and we read about a beast, and we can understand that from Daniel saw a beast, Daniel saw a great statue, and Revelation does hearken back a lot to Old Testament imagery. Now, I'm also going to do something a little different in this episode that I haven't done in previous episodes, and that I'm going to actually read the verses as we go along, because there's a lot that I want to help unpack and give you something to think about. Again, as I'm saying in the previous episodes, I'm not here to fight anybody over doctrine or your beliefs about end times. I'm simply presenting another way of looking at this that many people have never heard. Many people, all they believe and all they've ever been taught is that Jesus could come at any minute. Then there's going to be a rapture. There's going to be a 7-year tribulation. It's going to be really, really bad. And Antichrist is going to rise in the earth. And at the end of the 7-year period, there's going to be a battle of Armageddon. All the nations are going to come against Israel. And all of that. That is not how I see Revelation. There's many, many, many scholars out there that don't see it that way. But again, it's there's many people that do see it along that dispensational line of thinking. So let's jump into Revelation chapter 12. And as we do, I want us to see two things. Number one, Revelation chapter 12 is like a cosmic drama. It pulls back the curtain on the spiritual battle behind the birth of Jesus, the persecution of the early church, and God's powerful protection of his people. Much of this chapter, I believe, finds its fulfillment in the first century, especially surrounding Christ's coming and Jerusalem's fall in AD 70. Chapter 12 concerns itself with the great confrontation between God's kingdom, which includes the church, and the Roman Empire, between God and the devil, between Christ and the Caesars, between monotheism and polytheism, and between what is right and what is evil. Revelation chapter 12 begins a treatise against empire. So, first we're going to read Revelation 12, verses 1 through 2. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Now, first of all, notice that it's a great sign appears in heaven. Now, I do believe that this woman is giving birth to the Christ child. It's symbolic. This is what John's seeing as a sign in heaven. So again, we're not taking these images literally. This is what John is seeing in the spirit realm. So we on earth, those that are on the earth, they would have seen Jesus being born. We read about what happened in the natural realm. John is seeing what happened from a spiritual standpoint. So the woman symbolizes Israel, who was chosen to bring forth the Messiah. The imagery of her being clothed with the sun, moon, the moon under her feet, crown of 12 stars, this links back to Joseph's dream, Genesis 37:9. It indicates the 12 tribes of Israel. As we've said in previous episodes, anytime that you see the sun, the moon, the stars, it's talking about a governmental power or a nation. And in this particular case, it is the nation of Israel that was chosen by God to bring forth the Messiah. God chose Abraham and told Abraham through his seed, all the families of the earth would be blessed. And through Abraham, we have the 12 tribes of Israel. And then through the 12 tribes of Israel, through one particular tribe, we have the lineage all the way to Jesus. And then Jesus comes and saves the world from sin, dies on the cross, is resurrected, ascended to God, and sits at the right hand of the Father. But we also have to remember Eve, because God told Eve in Genesis 3:15 that her seed would crush the head of the serpent. Now, the serpent would bruise the heel of her seed, but her seed would crush the head of the serpent. Now, that's important because we're going to see that serpent show up here in Revelation chapter 12. So let's jump in and look at this. The labor pains symbolize the longing and the suffering of Israel leading up to the coming of Christ. And Israel did have a long and suffering history. There was a lot of tribulation that went on with the Jews. There was a lot of fighting that Israel had to go through. There was captivities because they wouldn't obey the covenant. And then you have the Roman occupation, and there was all kinds of stuff going on at that we've covered in previous episodes. But let's go on and read the next part, verse 3. Then another sign, so John is seeing another sign, appeared in heaven. And behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. Now, there's a teaching a popular teaching in the church that teaches that Satan was once an archangel named Lucifer that wanted to be like God, and they take that out of Isaiah, I believe it's 14, and another prophecy given in Ezekiel. Both of those prophetic words were given to kings. Now, there could be a double meaning to it. I don't know. I don't hold to the idea that Satan was an archangel that led worship in heaven anymore. But at the same time, I also don't believe that the Bible really gives us an origin of the Satan. And what's the other thing that's interesting is Satan is not a name, it's a title. In the Hebrew, it's Hasatan, the Satan, the accuser. We'll see why in just a few moments. But I don't know because, I don't believe that the Bible really gives us an origin of Satan. Now, if you hold to the idea that Lucifer was an archangel that rebelled against God and he became Satan, that would give you your origin. But what I want you to notice, though, is here that this great dragon swept away a third of the stars of heaven. That's where they get the idea that Satan caused a third of the angels to fall with him. But notice when this is happening. John is seeing this in the first century. John is seeing this sign in heaven, this dragon. Now, it doesn't say when he swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the ground, but it does say that the dragon stood before the woman. Now, I believe, though, and the way that I interpret this is all happening around the birth of Christ. You don't have to agree with that. That's fine. It doesn't really matter. But that's how I'm reading this, because John says another sign appeared in heaven, and he sees this dragon swoop a third of the stars. And again, we know that stars represent angels. So let's unpack this just a little bit. So the dragon, I believe, is Satan, because I believe that verse 9 confirms this. We'll see this in a moment. He works through earthly powers, often interpreted as Rome. We're going to see that in a little bit. And also even Herod in the nativity context, because Herod wanted to kill Jesus when he found out about Jesus being born. The 7 heads and 10 horns are political power and authority. This is commonly linked to the Roman Empire because the city of Rome sat on 7 hills, the 7 hills of Rome. The Roman Empire had 10 kingdoms with it. So I believe that even though the dragon is symbolic of the Satan, it also has an earthly aspect to it, that the Satan rules through people. Remember when Jesus was being tempted in the wilderness in Matthew chapter 4, the devil said to Jesus, just bow down and worship me, and I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world because they are mine to give. Now, there's different theories and ideas on how Satan got all the kingdoms. Most people think that it's because Adam ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and gave up his authority in the earth. We don't really know that. I mean, that is subjective to the way that we think. It is possible that that's what happened, but again, we're not told specifically in Scripture. So we have to be careful that we don't say certain things are the way they are unless Scripture gives us bedrock foundation for that. There's some things we just don't know. Now, he sweeps a third of the stars. I believe this is a reference to Satan's influence, and it is, I believe, a possible symbolic picture of fallen angels and demonic powers, but we don't know how they fail. Were they under Satan's influence? How did that happen? We really don't know. And John doesn't give us that picture. All he says, all that he saw was the dragon's tail swept a third of the stars. And notice that the dragon stands ready to devour the child. Think about Herod trying to kill baby Jesus. This is spiritual warfare at its most visible. So John's seeing this sign in heaven that this dragon wants to consume this woman's baby. That is in the realm of the spirit, and we see it in the natural because Herod did try to kill all the male babies under 2 years old in and around Bethlehem. That is what we would call spiritual warfare. Something's going on in the realm of the spirit that does play out in the natural. So let's look at verses 5 and 6. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Well, we know that's Christ, and that's a reference to Psalm 2. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God so that she would be nourished for 1,260 days. So just in that one verse, verse 5, she had this child, and the child was caught up to God and to his throne. We know through interpretation that this is Jesus. It's symbolic of Jesus. It's Jesus's birth, his death, burial, resurrection, and his ascension. It's all capitulated right in that one little verse. She had this child. The dragon wanted to kill this child, devour this child, but this child ended up was caught up to God and to his throne. And then we see in Revelation 1, John sees Jesus glorified. In Revelation 4, he sees Jesus on the throne. And so we know that this is Jesus. Let's unpack this, though, just a little bit. So Jesus, the male child, was born from the covenant people, the woman, destined to rule the nations with a rod of iron. As I said, that's out of Psalm 2. Caught up to God, his ascension. It's a quick summary of Jesus's victory and his enthronement. And then in verse 6, we see that the woman goes to the wilderness. And I believe that this is the church, the Christians, fleeing Jerusalem before the Roman siege in AD 66 through 70, which was based upon Jesus's warning in Matthew 24, verses 15 through 22, and also Luke 21, because Jesus said that when you see the abomination of desolation, the army surrounding Jerusalem, get out. And those that heeded Jesus's words, when they saw Rome come in and surround Jerusalem, they left and they went into Pella in the wilderness, and there they were protected. But notice that they were protected for 1,260 days. It's a symbolic period of protection and trial, but it matches the time of persecution under Roman and Jewish opposition. Rome waged war against Jerusalem and Israel for 3.5 years, 1,260 days. So the Christians were in the wilderness being protected by God. John's seeing this in the spirit, but that's what's happening in the natural. And so now we're going to look at verses 7 through 9. And there was war in heaven. When was there war? During this time of the Roman occupation of Jerusalem, during the Roman siege. There was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. Well, that's a strange place to put that, because most of us have been taught that the devil, the archangel, Lucifer, under that teaching, fell before the creation of Adam and Eve, fell before God ever created people, and that he was kicked out of heaven way back before Adam and Eve. But that's not what Revelation says. That's not what John's seen. John's seen this war in heaven, Michael and his angels battling the dragon and his angels. Now, some might say, well, there's a shift here, and John's seen way back before time began with Adam and Eve. You could say that, but it looks to me like everything is in a sequence. There was no longer a place found for them in heaven, and the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Now, this reminds me of Luke chapter 10, verse 18, where Jesus said, after the disciples had come back, Jesus had sent them out to heal diseases and heal people and cast out demons. And they came back and they were so excited, and they were telling Jesus everything that happened. And Jesus said, and I saw Satan fall like lightning. I believe that this is what Jesus was talking about here, or in Luke 18, this is what John is seeing happen, that Satan was thrown out of heaven during the first century. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, and a lot of answers or a lot of questions that I don't quite have answers for, but I know what this says, and I want to be true to what the scripture says and not just what I've been taught, because people have made things up. We see here through Jesus's words and through what John's seen in the Spirit, that the dragon, the serpent, the devil, was thrown out during this time period in the first century. Let's break this down a little bit. So there's spiritual conflict between God's angels, Michael, and the devil, Satan, Hasatan. And the Satan loses his place of accusation in heaven. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But the cross, the resurrection, and the ascension mark the decisive defeat of Satan's power to accuse God's people. And again, notice that Satan was cast down in the first century. So Jesus came to what? To destroy the works of the devil. That's why Jesus came. So the Satan, the devil, had power and authority until Christ defeated him at the cross and took away that power and that authority. Because Jesus said, all power and all authority has been given to me. And he gave that power and that authority to his disciples. So let's move on to verses 10 through 12. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. When? He said, now, when the devil, the dragon, was thrown out of heaven. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night, and they, the brethren, overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life, even when faced with death. Well, when were they faced with death? Throughout the first century, the 40 years from AD 30 to AD 70, we read about that through the epistles. Many Christians were giving their lives. They were being martyred. Paul, the apostle, before he became Apostle Paul, he was killing Christians, throwing them in jail, persecuting them. Verse 12 says, for this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and to the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. So if you're a futurist, you believe that that's later, that the devil's bound up, and then at the end of the tribulation and the millennial reign, the devil goes forth to deceive the nations because he only has a short time. But that's not what Revelation is saying here, interpreted through the lens of happening in the first century. So heaven rejoices because Satan is defeated by the blood of the Lamb and the faithfulness of the martyrs. Because look at this, verse 11, and they overcame him, who, the dragon, because of the blood of the Lamb. Well, the blood of the Lamb was not spilled until the cross. So we see the cross. John's seeing the cross from a heavenly perspective, what's going on. He's seen spiritual warfare and the victory that the church through Jesus has through his blood and through the word of our testimony and the faithfulness of the martyrs. But there is a warning issued, woe to the earth, because Satan now attacks the earthly realm. This represents increased persecution, especially of the early church. And we know that Rome persecuted Christians. The Jewish people that were not Christians, they persecuted the Christians. One of the things that I want you to understand and look at is it says they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. So one of the ways that we overcome the dragon, and the dragon's still fighting. Now, I don't believe he has any power, but we see here that he does fight because he's thrown down to the earth and he's got great wrath because he only has a short time. Now, I believe because Peter says, be sober, be vigilant, because your enemy, the devil, roams about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So he's only like a roaring lion. He really doesn't have any power other than the power you give him. And how do you give him power? By the words of your mouth. They overcame him by their testimony. Well, what is the testimony? A testimony is not just simply standing up. In church service when I was growing up, we had, the pastor would get up and say, has anybody got a testimony tonight? And somebody would pop up and say, well, I just want to thank God because this week I got a new car. Or I want to thank God this week because I got a raise. Or, I felt better. I was sick, but I felt better. I just want to thank God. That's my testimony. Or we say, well, I have a testimony. I want to share my testimony about how I got saved or how I came to know Jesus or whatever. But when you look at someone in a court that gives testimony, they are simply telling their story of what they know to be true. And that's the whole issue of a testimony. What is true? What you're saying, do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God, is what's oftentimes we have to repeat in court, that we swear or we make a promise that what we're about to say is the truth. We're not going to lie. We're simply telling what we know. And I believe it's so important that we know what God's heart is, what he says about us, what he says about other people, so that when we overcome by the blood of the Lamb that's already been spilt by Jesus, but the word of our testimony, we are in partnership with Jesus. And that's what the early Christians would have gotten, I believe, from this. They were in partnership with the Lamb. They had to give the word of their testimony. They had to testify about what they knew to be true. Well, what is true? Well, what is true is whatever God says. So oftentimes we put ourselves down. We demonize ourselves. We demonize our humanity. But we need to learn to speak the truth, and the truth is what God says about us, and that's how we overcome. So when the devil comes against you and hurls accusations, and he hurls accusations against other believers, we have an opportunity at that moment to either side with the accuser and become the devil's star witness, or we can become God's star witness and say, no, that's not true. That's not what God says about me. That's not what God says about them. Yeah, but they're this, this, and this. Well, they may have done those things, but that's not who they are. It is so important that we watch our words, because our words will either accuse or they will acquit. They will either condemn or they will encourage. And the way that we overcome the dragon is through the blood of Christ. We've already got that. But it's also by the word of our testimony. So let's move a little bit further into this. Let's take a look at verses 13 through 16. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Now, this could be part of what John's saying, could be the Romans coming against the church, coming against Israel. Because the church was part of Israel, is spiritual Israel. So the dragon is going against the woman. And then verse 14, but the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and times and a half a time from the presence of the serpent. Well, I believe that this again refers to the church being in the wilderness, being protected by God as the Roman Empire, with the dragon pushing them to destroy Israel. Verse 15, and the serpent, now notice, now it's not a dragon. When it was thrown down into the earth, it becomes a serpent. That's an interesting point. The serpent poured water like a river out of its mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of his mouth. So now we're back to the dragon. And again, it may just be a simple issue of semantics that a dragon and a serpent were called the same thing. But I do find it interesting that John calls it a serpent, which to me harkens back to the serpent in Genesis, trying to deceive Eve. And now, the serpent went after the woman. And now we've got the serpent going after a woman again. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And again, The testimony of Jesus. Well, what is that? It's what Jesus says, because he says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. You shall know my words. When you know my words, that's knowing the truth, and that's what sets us free, when we know the words of Jesus. And when I say know, I don't just mean that you know what Jesus said, but you're actually living it out. So let's take a look a little bit further. So the dragon pursues the woman. So we have persecution of the church. After Christ's ascension, Satan turns his rage against the church. Nero begins his persecution against the church, and that persecution was from AD 54 to AD 68. One of the sad things, and you can read about this through Josephus and other historians, is that Nero would put Christians up on poles, tar them, and then light them up and use them as human torches. It's also believed that that Nero burned a third of Rome, and then he blamed the Christians. And so persecution was raised against the Christians. So in this, we see that the dragon, because he can't get to the woman, he's going after her children. And he spews water, and the earth covers the water up. The earth swallows the water. Which, again, I find that's very interesting, because Romans, Paul tells us that the earth is crying out, groaning for the manifestations and the sons and daughters of God. So the earth wants God's children to be protected. The earth wants God's children to be manifest, because the earth will be blessed and is blessed because we've been given the mandate to take care of the earth. Let's look a little deeper. So we see the wilderness protection, that God preserves a remnant. Again, it's the early church's escape and spiritual protection. And the serpent spews water, symbolic of persecution. And then the dragon targets believers. Satan continues to wage war against the faithful Christians. And I believe that this includes the post-AD 70 church and ongoing persecution. See, again, this is a treatise against empire. And if you look throughout history, and even today, especially in China and communist countries, they persecute Christians. I believe, again, that's the dragon, spiritually speaking, the dragon still spewing water, trying to devour the children of the woman, trying to get at the woman. The enemy, the serpent, the dragon, the Hasatan, the devil, whatever term you want to use, is always trying to devour the children of God. Again, I remind you what Peter said. Peter said, be sober, be vigilant. You've got to be awake. You've got to be, you can't have your eyes closed, because your adversary, the devil, roams about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Now, Jesus stripped the enemy of his power and his authority, but all he has is lies. And he's still trying to get at people. And we know that people still succumb to the lies of the devil. We know that people don't walk in their true identity as sons and daughters of God. We know that people still believe lies about themselves, and they still believe lies about God, that he's not good, that he's angry, that he's pouring out punishment on people. That is part of, I believe, the dragon's warfare, because all he has is lies to deceive you, to make you believe something that's not true. And don't we see that in court? We see that with a good lawyer. A good lawyer will try to twist things around to make, I shouldn't say a good lawyer, some lawyers do this. They will try to twist things to make you believe that what really isn't true is true, or what's true isn't true. They'll twist things and manipulate things to make things seem different than what they really are. And ultimately, that's called a lie. And that's all that the devil has, is lies. That's all he's ever had from the beginning, is lies. And he keeps spewing his lies. But Jesus has taken away from him the power of death and the fear of death. So you and I can be hopeful today, because we don't have to be afraid. So the offspring, I believe this is Gentile believers and all who keep God's commandments and hold to Jesus, which is the church at large that we read about there in verse 17. So the key things here are Revelation 12 retells redemptive history symbolically, focusing on the birth, the victory, and the protection of the Messiah and his people. So the first century context is so essential because it highlights the conflict between the early church, apostate Israel, and the Roman Empire. And it affirms God's sovereign protection and the victory of Christ despite apparent chaos and persecution. Now, we do read where God did protect some of the church. Now, there were others that did die. And Jesus told them that. Jesus said in Matthew 24, they will persecute you and some of you will die. Some didn't. Some made it through the 1,260 days. They made it through the siege of Jerusalem because they weren't there. They were in the wilderness. But it wasn't just Jerusalem that Rome invaded. If you go back and study it out, you'll see that Rome invaded Israel and decimated numerous towns and places. But God did protect a remnant. God always protects a remnant. We see that throughout Scripture. So as we close this out, let's take a look at one more thing. Revelation 12 gives us a behind-the-scenes look at the birth of Jesus, the war in the spiritual realm, the struggles of the early church. But more than that, it's a promise that even in persecution, God protects his people. Satan is already defeated, and we overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. That's what makes this a hopeful chapter. And as I said at the very beginning of this series, Revelation is not a book to be feared. So many people fear the book of Revelation because they think it's in our future, and they're so afraid of all this bad stuff that's going to happen. For the early Christians, and remember, John was writing to 7 specific churches living in the first century under Roman occupation. This was a book of hope. It was a book of hope for the believers that he was writing it to. And I hope that you will see hope in this book. Next week is going to be an exciting week because now we also are going to be introduced to the beast, the mark of the beast. We're going to begin to see how all this stuff plays out. And we're going to see how it played out in the first century, because again, I believe that that's the context of the book of Revelation, not sometime in our future, but most of this has already happened in the first century, according to our interpretation, mine and others that are out there that believe this way. But again, I'm just trying to give you something to think about. Maybe you've never heard this before. I would encourage you, if you haven't been listening to the other episodes, go back and listen to those and see if it makes sense to you. But until next time, I just want to leave you with this. But before I close, please let me just say this again. Please like this, subscribe to it. This helps me get this out there. We're going to be doing more series later on after we get past Revelation, and I've got a ton of other material on this YouTube channel. You can also visit my website, michaelwilson.org, and I've got blogs on there. And you can also visit our church website. If you're in the West Tennessee area and you're looking for a church, we pastor a church, my wife and I, called Renovatus, and we're a church for misfits, dreamers, and the discontent. And we meet on Sunday evenings at 6 p.m. We currently meet at another church's facility. They allow us to use their facility on Sunday evenings, and we are appreciative of that. But you can find out more information at Renovatus, RENOVATUS.org. Till next time, just know this. You were created by love, out of love, to be loved, and to love. Now go and learn how to love well. God bless.